If kindness ever changes the fate of a kingdom, it begins with the moment someone chooses to trust what everyone else fears. Clara Whitmore had heard every warning since she was old enough to wander beyond the cedar fences of her grandmother's cottage. Never follow strange tracks into the northern woods. Never linger near Moonfall Spring after sunset. And if you ever see a black wolf, run without looking back. Yet on the first cool evening of early autumn, with golden leaves drifting across the forest floor and the last rays of daylight fading behind towering pines, Clara found herself doing the exact opposite. The spring rested in a hidden clearing nearly a mile from the nearest trail, a place so peaceful that even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb its glass-like surface. Wildflowers leaned toward the water, dragonflies skimmed across the silver reflections, and smooth stones circled the shoreline like ancient guardians. It had become Clara's sanctuary long before anyone else remembered it existed. She carried a small woven basket over one arm, humming softly as she arranged a folded towel, a fresh linen dress, and a bar of lavender soap made from herbs she had gathered herself. The long week had left her exhausted, and this quiet place was the only corner of the world where she could breathe without hearing whispers about being the quiet Omega who belonged nowhere important. She knelt beside the water and smiled as tiny ripples spread beneath her fingertips. Then she felt it. Not fear, not danger, simply the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching. She slowly turned her head toward the trees. Between two towering pines stood an enormous black wolf. He was unlike any wolf she had ever imagined. His coat shimmered like polished obsidian beneath the fading sunlight. His broad shoulders rose almost as high as her chest, even while standing still, and his pale silver eyes reflected a quiet intelligence that unsettled every story she had ever been told. Neither of them moved. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara studied him for several heartbeats before letting out the smallest laugh. "Well?" she whispered, brushing a loose strand of light. Brown hair behind her ear. "I suppose this is your forest before it's mine." The wolf remained perfectly still. No growl, no threatening step, only those steady silver eyes following every movement with impossible patience. Clara glanced around the clearing. "Would you mind guarding the spring while I wash up?" she asked with a gentle smile, speaking as though she were asking an old friend instead of the most mysterious creature in the northern wilderness. "If anyone comes by, just scare them away. Please." To her complete surprise, the giant wolf slowly lowered himself onto the moss beside the trail leading into the clearing. He faced away from the spring, ears alert, every muscle calm yet ready, like a silent sentinel who had accepted a duty without needing another word. Clara blinked once, then laughed quietly again. "Thank you," she said sincerely, never noticing how the wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Hidden behind those silver eyes was a truth that could shake every kingdom in the north. The creature watching over the forgotten spring was no ordinary wolf wandering through ancient woods. He was Lucian Blackwood, the Alpha King himself, hiding beneath black fur to escape the crushing weight of his crown for one precious evening. He had faced rival rulers without flinching. He had stood before thousands of warriors without lowering his gaze. Yet as he listened to the gentle sound of Clara moving beside the quiet spring, he discovered that the greatest battle he had ever fought was not against enemies or curses, but against the overwhelming instinct to remain exactly where she had asked him to be, protecting the peaceful trust she had offered so freely. The days slipped quietly into one another, and without either of them ever planning it, an unspoken routine settled over the hidden spring like morning mist. Clara always arrived shortly before the sun dipped behind the pine-covered hills, carrying the same woven basket and greeting the silent guardian as though he had been part of her life forever. "Good evening," she would say with an easy smile. "I brought fresh bread today. I am not sure if wolves enjoy bread, but I suppose there is no harm in asking." The great black wolf never accepted the offering while she watched, yet every time she returned the next day, the small piece she had carefully left on a nearby flat stone had disappeared. She chose to believe that somewhere in the forest another hungry creature had enjoyed it, but the faint sparkle that appeared in the wolf's silver eyes whenever she noticed the empty stone made her quietly wonder. Clara never spoke loudly. She simply filled the peaceful silence with little stories about her day. She talked about the herbs growing beside her grandmother's cottage, the stubborn chickens that refused to stay inside their fence, the neighbor's little boy who insisted every squirrel was secretly a prince, and the changing colors of the forest that somehow seemed more beautiful every evening. The wolf listened without moving, his ears shifting ever so slightly whenever she laughed. It had been years since anyone had spoken to Lucian Blackwood without expecting a command, a judgment, or a royal decision. Kings rarely heard ordinary conversations. They heard requests, reports, complaints, and endless debates. Yet this young Omega spoke to him without knowing who he was, asking nothing except that he remain nearby. It was a kind of peace he had almost forgotten could exist. Every evening, before Clara stepped into the crystal-clear spring, she would glance toward him with complete trust. "You know the rules," she teased one evening with a grin. "Face the forest." As if understanding every word, the enormous wolf calmly turned away from the water and settled into his familiar position overlooking the narrow trail leading into the clearing. Clara smiled, shaking her head. "You really are the most polite wolf I have ever met." If the royal council had witnessed the mighty Alpha King obediently following the playful request of an unknown village Omega, they would never have believed their own eyes. Yet Lucian remained perfectly still, focusing instead on the sounds beyond the trees. Every fluttering bird, every curious deer, every distant footstep passed through his heightened senses long before it came anywhere near the spring. More than once he quietly rose and wandered just far enough into the woods to discourage wandering travelers from approaching, returning before Clara even realized anyone had been nearby. She only noticed that the forest always seemed unusually peaceful whenever he was there. One cool evening, a frightened white rabbit burst into the clearing, trembling so hard that it nearly stumbled into Clara's basket. She immediately knelt and scooped the tiny creature into her arms. "Easy now," she whispered gently. "Nothing here wants to hurt you." The rabbit slowly relaxed beneath her calm voice before hopping away into the ferns. Lucian watched the simple moment with quiet astonishment. The kindness she offered was never reserved for people alone. It flowed naturally toward every living thing around her, expecting nothing in return. As twilight deepened, Clara gathered her things and looked toward the great wolf once again. "I think you have become my favorite secret," she admitted softly. "Everyone else sees danger when they hear stories about a black wolf. I only see someone who has never once given me a reason to be afraid." Lucian remained motionless until she disappeared safely along the winding forest path. Only after her footsteps faded into the evening breeze did he slowly lift his head toward the rising moon. For the first time in many years, the ancient curse resting deep within his blood grew strangely quiet. It did not vanish. It simply waited, as though even the darkness recognized that something rare had begun beside the forgotten spring. Lucian Blackwood returned to the royal citadel before dawn, leaving the quiet forest behind with reluctant steps that no member of his court would have recognized. By the time the towering gates closed behind him, the gentle silence of Moonfall Spring had already been replaced by polished stone corridors, echoing council chambers, and the endless weight of a crown that never allowed a moment of rest. Servants bowed as he passed. Royal guards lowered their heads. Advisors waited with stacks of parchment detailing border disputes, harvest reports, trade negotiations, and complaints from distant pacts. Lucian answered each question with calm precision, yet part of his mind remained somewhere beneath the cedar trees, where a quiet Omega believed she had befriended nothing more than a mysterious black wolf. Lord Aldrin, the oldest member of the royal council, studied the king with growing concern. "Your Majesty," he said carefully after the final meeting ended, "you have been leaving the palace almost every evening for the past 2 weeks. Rumors travel faster than ravens." Lucian met the older man's eyes without revealing the slightest emotion. Then perhaps the council should concern itself with governing instead of chasing rumors. The chamber fell silent. No one dared continue the subject, but the questions remained in every face. Once darkness settled over the kingdom again, Lucian crossed the palace grounds alone before disappearing into the forest in the familiar form that granted him the only freedom he still possessed. The transformation no longer felt like an escape from enemies. It felt like a journey toward peace. As the towering black wolf moved through the moonlit woods, every familiar scent welcomed him home. Pine, fresh rain, wildflowers. cool stone. And beneath them all, the soft lavender fragrance that always lingered near the hidden spring. He arrived before Clara, taking his usual place beside the narrow trail. Minutes later, he heard the gentle rhythm of her footsteps long before she entered the clearing. She smiled the instant she saw him. "I was hoping you would be here," she said, setting down her basket. "Grandmother says autumn will arrive early this year. Soon the mornings will be too cold for the flowers." She wandered around the clearing, gathering a few fallen leaves whose colors ranged from brilliant gold to deep crimson. Holding one against the wolf's dark shoulder, she laughed softly. "You make every color look brighter." Lucian remained perfectly still, though her simple words stirred something inside him that no royal praise had ever accomplished. She admired nothing about power because she had never seen it. She admired only what was quietly present before her. Clara settled beside a smooth stone and gazed across the peaceful water. "Can I tell you a secret?" she whispered. The wolf slowly turned his head toward her. "Sometimes I think you understand every word I say." She smiled to herself before shaking her head. "That sounds foolish, does not it?" If only she knew. Lucian understood every word, every pause, every hopeful sigh that escaped her lips. He understood because he listened, not as a king evaluating a subject, but as a lonely man discovering what ordinary happiness sounded like. Yet another truth remained hidden beneath his calm exterior. Each passing evening made the quiet bond between them stronger, and with it came an instinct older than kingdoms themselves. It was not anger. It was not possession. It was an overwhelming desire to remain near the one person who expected nothing from him except honesty that she did not even realize he had been withholding. Every time Clara stepped closer, Lucian silently reminded himself of the promise he had made the very first evening she trusted him. He would protect that trust before anything else, even if it meant hiding the truth a little longer. Even if every beat of his heart urged him to stop pretending that he was only a silent guardian beneath the trees. The first whispers began in the marketplace before they ever reached the palace. Hunters returning from the northern trails spoke of enormous paw prints pressed deep into the damp earth after every rainfall. Woodcutters claimed they had glimpsed a black shadow moving silently between ancient pines, disappearing before anyone could follow. Children invented games about the mysterious guardian of the forest, while merchants quietly warned travelers not to wander alone after sunset. Clara listened to every story with the same gentle smile. Unlike everyone else, she knew the great wolf had never shown the slightest sign of cruelty. To her, the rumors sounded as though people were describing an entirely different creature. One afternoon, while helping her grandmother bundle dried lavender outside the cottage, an elderly neighbor stopped by carrying a basket of apples. "Have you heard?" she asked in a hushed voice. "The Northern Council has offered a handsome reward for anyone who discovers where the black wolf is hiding." Clara's hands paused for only a moment before she resumed tying the herbs together. "Perhaps they should leave him alone," she answered softly. The woman looked surprised. "You would defend a beast that no one understands." Clara glanced toward the distant tree line where the forest stretched beneath the autumn sky. Sometimes fear grows faster than truth. The conversation ended there, but the words stayed with her long after the neighbor walked away. That same evening, Lucian reached the hidden spring earlier than usual. Long before Clara appeared, unfamiliar scents drifted through the woods. Leather boots, campfire smoke, iron tools. None of them belonged in this peaceful corner of the forest. He moved silently through the trees until he spotted 3 mounted scouts studying fresh tracks along the trail. They spoke quietly among themselves, pointing toward the western hills before turning back toward the kingdom. Lucian remained hidden until they disappeared beyond the ridge. The search had begun. When Clara finally stepped into the clearing carrying her familiar basket, she immediately noticed that the wolf was standing instead of resting beside the trail. "You seem worried today," she said gently. "Did something happen?" The great black wolf watched the surrounding forest with careful attention before slowly relaxing as she approached. Clara frowned with quiet concern. "I suppose even brave guardians have difficult days." She unpacked a small cloth bundle and placed several slices of roasted turkey beside the usual flat stone. "Grandmother insisted I bring something better than bread. She says anyone who watches over people deserves a proper meal." Lucian lowered his head slightly, almost as though acknowledging the unexpected kindness. Clara laughed quietly. You really do understand me, do not you? Above them, a flock of birds suddenly lifted into the evening sky, startled by something far beyond the clearing. The peaceful forest became strangely still. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate among the pines. Clara noticed the change immediately. That is odd, she whispered. Everything became quiet all at once. The wolf stepped between Clara and the narrow entrance to the clearing, his silver eyes fixed on the distant trees. She could not hear what he heard, nor sense what his heightened instincts had already discovered, but she trusted his judgment without question. Instead of asking questions, she simply rested one hand lightly against the rough bark of a nearby cedar and waited. After several long moments, the sounds of the forest slowly returned. Songbirds called again from the branches, leaves rustled overhead, and the tension quietly dissolved. Clara released a small breath and smiled at her silent companion. Whatever it was, she said warmly, I knew you would make sure nothing reached me. Hidden behind calm silver eyes, Lucian made a silent promise that no royal oath had ever carried more weight. The hunters could search every mountain and every valley if they wished, but as long as Clara continued walking this lonely path, no danger would reach her without first passing through him. The following afternoon arrived beneath a sky painted with slow-moving gray clouds, and the hidden spring felt different before Clara even stepped into the clearing. The usual chorus of birds was quieter, and the gentle breeze carried unfamiliar scents from deeper within the forest. She paused at the edge of the trees, tightening her fingers around the handle of her woven basket. The great black wolf was already waiting. Instead of resting beside the trail as he always did, he stood alert upon a smooth ridge overlooking the water, his silver eyes scanning every shadow between the towering pines. When he noticed Clara, his posture softened only slightly before he descended the slope with calm, measured steps. You came early today, Clara said with a warm smile that never quite hid the concern in her eyes. I was beginning to think you might have found another spring to guard. The wolf stopped beside her, giving the faintest tilt of his head. Clara laughed quietly. I will take that as a no. She unpacked her basket as usual, arranging everything with familiar care, but before she could finish, distant voices drifted through the trees. They were too far away for her to understand, yet close enough to erase the peaceful silence that had become part of this place. Clara looked toward the forest. Did you hear that? She whispered. The wolf had already heard it long before she spoke. Hidden beyond the ridge, several royal trackers carefully followed broken branches and fresh paw prints that Lucian himself had unknowingly left during previous evenings. They carried ropes, lanterns, and long walking staffs, speaking cautiously as they searched for signs of the mysterious guardian everyone now discussed across the kingdom. None of them realized they were only a few hundred feet away. Lucian stepped directly between Clara and the narrow path leading toward the voices. His broad frame blocked the entrance completely. Clara studied him for a long moment before quietly nodding. You want me to stay here? The wolf did not move. All right, she answered without hesitation. I trust you. Those 4 simple words echoed more deeply inside Lucian than any royal oath ever had. He disappeared into the trees with astonishing speed, moving so silently that within seconds even Clara could no longer hear him. She waited beside the spring exactly as he had silently asked, listening to the breeze ripple across the water. Several anxious minutes passed before distant voices suddenly shifted direction. One tracker called for the others to follow a different trail farther west, convinced the wolf had crossed another ridge. Their footsteps gradually faded until the forest grew peaceful once again. Moments later, the great black wolf emerged from the trees exactly as calm as before, though a few golden leaves clung to his dark coat after weaving through the dense branches. Clara smiled with visible relief. I knew you would come back. She gently brushed one of the leaves from his shoulder before realizing what she had done. The wolf remained perfectly still, his silver eyes meeting hers with quiet gentleness. Clara quickly withdrew her hand, smiling with slight embarrassment. Sorry, she said softly. You just looked like autumn decided to decorate you. If she had looked more closely, she might have noticed the almost imperceptible hesitation in his breathing. Not because of fear, not because of danger, simply because no one had touched him with such innocent kindness in longer than he could remember. As the evening sunlight shimmered across the still water, Lucian understood something that unsettled him far more than the approaching search parties. Protecting Clara from the kingdom would be possible. Protecting his carefully guarded heart from the quiet Omega who trusted him so completely was becoming impossible. Morning rain washed the forest clean, leaving tiny drops of water clinging to every cedar branch like scattered crystals. By late afternoon, the clouds drifted away, revealing a pale blue sky that reflected across the quiet spring. Clara hurried along the familiar trail with an unusual excitement in her step. She had spent the morning weaving a simple cord from dried wildflowers and soft green grasses, smiling to herself as she wondered whether a wolf would tolerate such an unexpected gift. When she entered the clearing, however, her smile slowly faded. The black wolf was there, but something felt different. He stood near the edge of the water instead of greeting her from the trail, his posture unusually rigid, as though he had been listening for danger all day. "You really have been worried lately," Clara murmured. She walked closer without hesitation, holding up the little woven cord. "I made something for you. It is probably the strangest gift anyone has ever given a wolf." Lucian watched her approach, every instinct urging him to remain perfectly still. During the previous night, he had overheard members of the royal council discussing plans to search the northern forest themselves. The peaceful refuge he had protected so carefully was becoming the center of growing attention, and every passing day increased the chance that Clara would be drawn into secrets she had never asked to carry. She reached him with her familiar gentle smile. "May I?" she asked softly, lifting the tiny wreath. The enormous wolf lowered his head just enough for her to slip it loosely around his neck. Clara stepped back and laughed quietly. "There, now you look much less mysterious." Lucian could not remember the last time anyone had offered him something. Made entirely by hand with no expectation of reward. Kings received priceless treasures every season, yet none of them carried the warmth of this simple circle of woven flowers. As Clara admired her work, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it unfamiliar voices from the eastern ridge. This time they were much closer than before. Clara turned immediately. "Someone is coming." Lucian's ears lifted sharply. He recognized the voices. Royal guards. They were moving faster than expected, following fresh tracks directly toward the spring. There would be no time to quietly lead them away. Clara looked back at the wolf, noticing the unusual intensity in his silver eyes. "Should I leave?" she whispered. Instead of stepping aside, Lucian gently nudged her toward a cluster of enormous boulders partially hidden beneath climbing ivy. She understood at once and moved behind the natural shelter without question. Moments later, several distant figures appeared between the trees. They never reached the clearing. Before they came close enough to glimpse Clara, the black wolf deliberately emerged from the opposite side of the forest and crossed an open ridge where he could easily be seen. One startled guard pointed toward the dark silhouette, and the entire search party changed direction, following the magnificent animal deeper into the woods. Clara watched in astonishment as her silent guardian disappeared beyond the trees, willingly drawing every curious eye away from the peaceful spring. The clearing became quiet once more, but the minutes stretched into nearly an hour before she heard familiar footsteps returning through the forest. The great black wolf emerged slowly from the fading light, breathing a little harder than usual, but otherwise unharmed. Relief filled Clara's face before she could hide it. "You came back," she whispered. "I knew you would." She smiled with quiet gratitude, never realizing that the man hidden behind those silver eyes had just made a choice no king should ever have needed to make. For the first time since claiming the throne, Lucian Blackwood had allowed the safety of one ordinary Omega to matter more than protecting the secrecy of his own crown. That night, the moon rose brighter than Clara had ever seen, turning the quiet spring into a mirror of silver light. She arrived later than usual after helping her grandmother prepare the cottage for the colder weather, wondering if her silent guardian had already given up waiting. Instead, she found him resting beside the water exactly where he always did, the little wreath she had woven still hanging loosely around his neck. It had become slightly worn after traveling through the forest, yet he had never removed it. Clara smiled so warmly that even the cool evening air seemed gentler. "You kept it," she whispered. "I thought it would have fallen apart by now." The great black wolf slowly lifted his head, watching her with those calm silver eyes that somehow always seemed to understand more than any ordinary animal should. Clara settled onto the smooth stone beside the spring instead of unpacking her basket right away. She hugged her knees and looked across the quiet water. "Can I tell you another secret?" she asked softly. "I do not think I have ever felt safer anywhere than I do here." Lucian listened without moving. Her words reached far beyond his ears. They settled somewhere deep inside the lonely places that years of duty had left untouched. She trusted him completely, never realizing she had placed that trust in the most powerful man in the kingdom. Clara continued speaking as though the forest itself were listening. "People keep saying someone dangerous is hiding in these woods. They talk about kings, soldiers, curses, and monsters. I wish they would come here instead of telling stories. They would see what I see." She laughed quietly before looking toward him again. "They would see someone who has never once broken a promise." Lucian lowered his gaze for a single moment. If only she knew how many promises he had already made to himself because of her. Every evening he reminded himself that he would keep his distance. Every evening he promised he would not allow his growing feelings to influence her peaceful life. Every evening he silently vowed that her trust would remain untouched by fear or obligation. Yet each promise became more difficult to keep. There was an ancient instinct woven into every alpha, one that called them to remain close to those destined to change their lives. Lucian had spent years mastering every part of himself through discipline and restraint, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet strength of simple kindness. It was not a battle against anger. It was a battle against the longing to reveal the truth before the proper time. Clara rose and walked toward the edge of the spring where the moonlight shimmered across the water. She smiled without turning around. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "if you really could understand me, I think you would tell me to stop worrying about everyone else and start believing that good things can happen too." Lucian took one slow step forward before forcing himself to stop. The distance between them remained exactly as it had always been, carefully respectful, carefully safe. He understood that crossing it before she knew who he truly was would betray the trust she had offered so freely. Clara glanced back over her shoulder and noticed him standing there. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not because you scare people away. Not because you guard this place. Thank you for simply staying." The words settled over the clearing like a quiet blessing. Lucian closed his eyes for the briefest moment beneath the moonlit sky. The kingdom believed its Alpha King possessed unmatched strength because he could command warriors and lead nations. They were wrong. His greatest strength was standing only a few feet from the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his heart, choosing every single day to honor her trust instead of claiming the truth before she was ready to receive it. The following evening the forest welcomed Clara with an uneasy silence that no songbird seemed willing to disturb. Even the surface of the spring, usually as peaceful as polished glass, rippled beneath an unexpected breeze. She paused beneath the towering cedars and instinctively looked for the familiar black figure waiting near the trail. He was there, but unlike every evening before, he stood on the highest rock overlooking the clearing, his silver eyes fixed far beyond the trees. Clara felt a quiet ache in her chest. "Something is wrong," she whispered. Lucian did not turn immediately. His senses had already discovered what the wind carried toward them. Horses, royal banners, the unmistakable scent of members of his own court. They were no longer sending ordinary trackers. This time the kingdom itself had entered the forest. Earlier that afternoon, Lord Aldrin had stood before the royal council insisting that the mysterious black wolf threatened the stability of the northern territories. Several nobles demanded a public hunt to calm frightened villages, never realizing that the creature they discussed was sitting silently upon the throne only hours before. Lucian had ended the meeting without revealing the truth, but he knew they would continue searching with or without his approval. Clara slowly climbed the smooth hillside until she stood a respectful distance beside him. "You always know before anyone else arrives," she said gently. "I suppose that is another one of your secrets." The wolf glanced toward her before looking back at the forest. She followed his gaze and noticed tiny flashes of sunlight reflecting from polished armor nearly half a mile away between the trees. "Someone really is coming," she murmured. Instead of fear, an unexpected feeling settled inside her. Sadness. She suddenly realized that if enough people entered these woods, this peaceful place, might disappear forever. She rested one hand against the rough bark of a cedar tree and looked toward the spring. I wish people would stop chasing things they do not understand, she said quietly. Not everything mysterious needs to become a trophy or a story. Lucian closed his eyes for one brief moment. Those words struck deeper than Clara could possibly imagine. She was defending him without knowing his name, his title, or the burden he carried every day. The breeze shifted again, carrying another scent unlike the others. It was ancient, gentle, and strangely familiar. High above the clearing, soft moonlight slipped through the branches even though the sun had not completely disappeared. Clara noticed dozens of tiny white butterflies drifting across the water, moving together as though guided by an invisible hand. "That is beautiful," she whispered. "I have never seen butterflies at this time of year." They circled the spring only once before disappearing into the glowing evening light, leaving behind a quiet sense of peace that settled over the clearing. Lucian understood the old stories better than anyone. Among the oldest packs, white butterflies appearing beneath an early moon were believed to be a blessing from the moon goddess, a silent reminder that destiny moved according to its own perfect timing. He looked toward Clara, and for the first time since meeting her, he allowed himself to wonder whether fate had been guiding every step that had led them here. Clara smiled as another gentle breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. "Whatever tomorrow brings," she said softly, "I hope this place never forgets us." Hidden behind calm silver eyes, Lucian made one final decision. The time for hiding behind silence was nearing its end. If destiny truly intended to change both of their lives, then when the moment finally arrived, she would hear the truth from him before she ever heard it from the kingdom. The next evening arrived wrapped in quiet anticipation. Clara followed the familiar trail beneath towering pines, her heart strangely calm despite the growing rumors that surrounded the northern forest. As she stepped into the clearing, she immediately noticed that the black wolf was waiting exactly where they had first met, sitting beside the narrow path with the faded wreath of wildflowers still resting around his neck. She smiled, feeling as though time itself had paused to preserve one perfect moment. "I was hoping you would be here," she whispered. "I think today feels different." The wolf slowly rose to his feet, his silver eyes never leaving hers. For several long heartbeats, neither of them moved. The evening breeze carried the scent of cedar, fresh water, and the first hints of approaching winter. Then, without warning, soft moonlight spilled across the clearing even though the sun had only begun to disappear beyond the hills. Clara looked upward in quiet wonder. The light seemed brighter than it should have been, bathing the spring in a gentle silver glow. Around them, dozens of white butterflies appeared once again, circling lazily above the water before drifting through the trees like living pieces of moonlight. The wolf stepped forward only once before stopping at the same respectful distance he had always kept. Clara smiled gently. "You have always known exactly how close to stand," she said softly. "You never frightened me. You never asked for anything. You simply stayed." The words settled into the evening air, and something quietly changed. The great black wolf lowered his head, and shimmering silver light slowly surrounded his dark form. Clara instinctively took a single step backward, not because she was afraid, but because she sensed she was witnessing something sacred. The silver light grew brighter, wrapping gently around the enormous wolf until the familiar shape gradually faded. When the light finally settled, a tall man stood where the silent guardian had been only moments before. His dark hair stirred in the breeze. His silver eyes carried the same calm kindness she had known for weeks, and the faded wreath of woven wildflowers still rested carefully in his hands. Clara stared in complete silence as recognition slowly replaced surprise. It was not his appearance that convinced her. It was his eyes. They had always been the same. "It was you," she breathed. The man inclined his head respectfully. "My name is Lucian Blackwood." He paused, allowing the truth to settle gently instead of forcing it upon her. "I am the Alpha King." Clara searched his face for any sign that the quiet guardian she had trusted had disappeared. She found none. He looked at her exactly as he always had, with patience, gratitude, and quiet respect. Lucian held the little wreath carefully before speaking again. "Every evening you trusted someone you believed was only a lonely wolf. You offered kindness without expecting a reward. You spoke honestly because you believed no crown was listening." His voice remained calm. There were many times I wanted to tell you the truth, but I feared that revealing my title too soon would take away the simple friendship you freely offered. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that nothing truly important had changed. The king standing before her was still the silent guardian who had listened to every story, watched every sunset, and honored every request she had ever made. She smiled through the emotion filling her heart. Then I suppose I have been talking to a king this entire time. Lucian returned the smallest smile. No, he answered gently. You have been talking to a man who finally remembered what peace feels like. He slowly knelt before her, not as a ruler making a proclamation, but as someone offering sincere gratitude. He placed the little wreath between them with great care. You once asked a lonely wolf to protect your peace. You never knew that your kindness protected mine as well. Clara looked toward the quiet spring where their story had begun, then back to the man before her. Without hesitation, she offered him her hand. Lucian accepted it with the same quiet respect that had defined every evening they had shared. Above them, the white butterflies disappeared into the moonlit sky, and the forgotten spring remained exactly as it always had, a place where trust had spoken more loudly than fear, where kindness had revealed the heart beneath a crown, and where true strength had quietly chosen gentleness before destiny ever spoke its name.